And everybody laughed at that because it is a kind of a joke. But on the other hand, it seemed to me it was a wonderful truth about it. That is that, in a sense, what do we know about what we're doing in churches? Our rituals or our lack of rituals, the way we read the Bible in one way at a certain time and another way at another time. In what sense do we think we have in some way mastered who God is, the unimaginable, the gracious, the glorious, the inexpressible God, whom in our little services we do the best we can to describe and react to, but it is in many ways laughable. The most moving thing that happened was in San Francisco, where following one of her lectures, there was a question and answer period, during the course of which a man stood up and said, "Miss Angelou, will you tell us something about racism? Do you find it better than it was, or worse? Is it you're more aware of it on the East Coast and the West Coast and so on?" And she said, "Let me tell you a story." And the story she told was this, that she had been in the San Francisco area some, 10 or 15 years earlier for the purpose of putting on a public television show on African art. And before the show was to go on, she had a call from a stranger who said that he happened to have a collection of African statues of some kind, which he thought might be very useful to her on this program, and perhaps she'd like to see them and maybe use them. So of course she accepted the offer and saw them, and they were indeed just what she wanted. And so he lent them to her, and she used them in her program in very artful ways, which were appealing to the man who'd lent them. And as a result of that, they started a friendship. She got to know the man and his wife. They had dinner together a number of times and got to be really good pals. Then the public television thing was over, and she went back to the East Coast, and only a few years later returned to the Bay Area. And remembering this friendship, she called up the man and said, "It's Maya Angelou, I'm back again. I'd love to pick up our friendship where we left it off. I enjoyed you so much before." He said, "Terrific. Let me tell you a little bit about what I've been doing during the interval." And what he'd been doing, he said, had been in Europe working with the problems of the American troops stationed over there. And she said, "Oh, how did it go?" And he said, "Well," he said, "the black troops have a particularly hard time because they're black and there aren't many blacks around and so on. But he said, our boys also." And she said, "What did you say?" And he said, "I said the black troops have a particularly difficult time for various reasons, but our boys also." And she said, "What did you say?" And a third time she went through it, and all of a sudden, as she described it, he himself heard what he'd said and said, in effect, "This is the most awful thing I've ever done. I can't continue the conversation. I've got to hang up to have said such a thing to you, Maya Angelou, the black boys, our boys." And she said, no, she said, "This is just where we must talk, because that's what racial prejudice is. Beneath the sort of superficial liberal utterance, there is the deep, sort of ingrained sense of black boys, our boys." Nonetheless, she said, they continued the conversation and agreed to meet. What happened then was she tried a number of times, as she described it, to get hold of him, to meet him and see him and his wife. And again, the calls didn't go through. She left messages which weren't answered. And finally, the whole thing just fizzled out. So that was, in a way, her answer to the question, how about racism? And it moved her and upset her. And that was the last question she took that day. The next day, for the second set of lectures we were to give, she returned to the podium and she said, "I'm sure you noticed that I was moved by what I told you yesterday in answer to your question about racism." And then she said a remarkable thing happened. As I was leaving the hall, she said, a man in the audience stood up and said, "Here I am." And it was the man that she'd been talking about. And as she said that, there we all sat, the man himself again rose up, a small, white, bearded Episcopal clergyman, as it turned out, and he walked up to the platform and threw his arms around Maya Angelou and she around him, and they embraced one another and they wept. And it was one of the most moving moments I think I've ever been part of for many, many ways. What makes it so moving? I think that what we saw was not only racial barriers, but so many different kinds of barriers separate us as human beings: fear, mistrust, misunderstanding, and anger, loneliness, the inability to communicate with each other. even those sometimes we love the most and are closest to, that in so many ways we move through our lives like lepers, the untouchable ones, the unclean ones, afraid to touch other people's lives or let our lives be touched by other people, ashamed of our own uncleanness, suspicious of other people. And what was so moving was that when that large black woman and that small white man embraced, we saw that no one is untouchable, not even ourselves. And we saw that, as Maya Angelou said, we all do have the same story when you get right down to what life is really all about. And we saw that the kingdom of God, as Jesus said, is really among us, potentially, always, as the capacity we have, as those two people at that time had, to love and to forgive and to allow oneself to be loved and to be forgiven. When the church, when you and I fail to embody what happened at that moment in the church when Maya Angelou and the white man embraced each other, when the church fails to embody that moment, all that we do in church becomes sort of empty, a kind of ecclesiastical vaudeville, and the laughter in the laughter room is bitter laughter. Where the church, when it doesn't embody that kind of forgiveness and love, becomes in many ways like a dysfunctional family, which consists of a sort of superficial togetherness and yet a kind of inner loneliness, hidden agendas, ministers who are apt to hide their humanness behind their sermons, and parishioners who are apt to hide their humanness from their ministers. But where the church does embody what happened, that moment of grace that I've been describing to you, when it does embody that, then the laughter in the laughter room is of all laughter, I think, the holiest, because we have not only heard the good news, but in a sense we have become the good news. Like lepers, we are cleansed by the love of God working among us and within us. And that is what healing is about, and what wholeness is about, and what the church and the kingdom of God are all about. Thank you.